Hello, welcome to Ms. Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Ms. Peepers. Let's talk about books. Friends, I sit here with you today as the proud reader of a truly intimidating classic, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. In fact, I'm so proud of myself, I bought the t-shirt. As you may know, this is the story of a man who is obsessed with stories of chivalry and knights errant. Although he lives in a time when knight errantry is simply the stuff of legends, he decides to bring it all back. So he gives himself the name Don Quixote, hires Sancho Panza to be his squire, and together they roam around the Spanish countryside looking for adventure. Don Quixote is so committed to this story that to him, an average inn is in fact a castle, a woman passing by is a noble lady in need of assistance, and there are villains and even giants everywhere. I think a lot of people are familiar with the episode in which Don Quixote mistakes windmills for giants and attacks them with his lance. Throughout this book, there are a lot of such stories of his misinterpretations based on what he expects to see as a knight errant. I mentioned at the beginning that this is an intimidating classic, and it definitely is. Well, I have a pretty compact edition. It's still over 1,000 pages, and the text is tiny. I feel very fortunate to have gotten a hold of the translation by Tom Lathrop, which is written in plain English. It has a ton of footnotes explaining the historical context of various episodes, the plays on words that didn't translate well from the Spanish, and why the author made some of the choices that he did throughout the story. This story is incredibly episodic. There are over 300 characters. There are interweaving storylines, and there are even moments when the author contradicts himself, which the translator points out was likely highly intentional, because Cervantes doesn't do this in any of his other work. For example, Sancho Panza's wife is given several names throughout the story. Cervantes was satirizing chivalric romances, which at the time were full of inconsistencies and logical loopholes. And so this book also is filled with inconsistencies and logical loopholes. And it was incredibly helpful to me to have those footnotes pointing out, oh yeah, you didn't misremember this. It really was different 2 pages ago. And so that definitely makes this a challenging text to read. So why did I even pick this up? No one made me. I actually came to Don Quixote through another book, The True and Outstanding Adventures of the Hunt Sisters by Elizabeth Robinson. This is an epistolary novel detailing the relationship between two sisters, Olivia and Maddie. And the relevance here is that Olivia is a film producer trying to make a movie out of Don Quixote. There's a lot in this book about idealism and going after impossible dreams. As I was reading this book, I realized I didn't really know a whole lot about Don Quixote, other than having seen Man of La Mancha some time ago, which is a watered down version, very streamlined version of this story. And I didn't really fully understand why making the movie was so challenging. I thought, well, it's an adventure. It's about a guy who thinks he's a knight. How hard is that? And then I picked up the book. I do recommend this, by the way. This is a good book. Sad in parts, funny in parts. Watching Olivia navigate her career, her romantic relationship, and also her family relationships is it's a wild ride. So as I read Don Quixote, I realized just how episodic it is and just how challenging it would be to make into a comprehensible movie that makes any kind of sense, especially to a modern viewer. I think you could probably do a TV series out of it, and not just like a 1-season limited series, but you could probably get 3 or 4 seasons out of this easily. But the challenge would be getting that modern audience to appreciate the nuances, which candidly, I personally would have missed if not for the footnotes. I do think that I might have gotten more out of this if I had read it with somebody else or read it in a class, but I still very much enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it. And I learned a bit about Cervantes as well throughout this story. For example, this book was published actually in 2 parts, which were published, I think, about 10 years apart. Part 1 was released. Cervantes went on to other projects, and then someone else writing under the name Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda Apologies for my Spanish pronunciation. I took German and French. Anyway, he wrote a part 2 to Cervantes' novel, and Cervantes read it and did not like it. He didn't appreciate the changes that Avellaneda had made, and he really felt that it was just really poorly written. Cervantes was mad, and I think Cervantes had already started writing part 2, but he shifted his tone at that point and started including this imposter novel, if you will, in his own work. And he wrote another 500 pages or so that, among other things, included frequent references to this work. Don Quixote runs into this other story and says, wait a minute, that's not me. This doesn't describe me at all. I've never done these things. Cervantes had a lot of problems with this. I guess you'd call it fan fiction. He did not like the way that his characters were portrayed. In Avellaneda's work, for example, Don Quixote is said to have fallen out of love with his lady, Dulcinea del Toboso, who is a primary motivator for Don Quixote. Don Quixote, in Cervantes' part 2, when he comes across this book, is incredibly offended at the idea that he would ever cast away his love for Dulcinea. This is the core of everything that he does for knight errantry, so why would he ever cast her aside? So throughout the second part, we run into instances of this novel. There are moments when Don Quixote runs into, finds copies of this novel. People have it. They end up seeing the printers, coming across the printers that are actually publishing the false Don Quixote. And he even runs into someone who claims to know the other Don Quixote. There's this interesting kind of meta moment of, is the other Don Quixote real? Are these false stories about the fictional but real in this world Don Quixote? It gets at points a little bit silly, but it's entertaining nonetheless. Having that context of knowing that a lot of this second part is spite writing is it gives Cervantes a little bit of extra character. Now, I should mention content warnings, of course. This book, published in the 1600s, presents views that at the time were considered entirely normal and mainstream. There is a lot of sexism in here. There's religious intolerance in here. There is racism and xenophobia. So please be aware of that going in. Doesn't make it okay that Cervantes included these things in his book, but given the time period, it is unfortunately not surprising. Now, a core theme of this book is, of course, mental illness. And it's interesting how that shows up in this work. There are a lot of instances of characters making fun of Don Quixote or even being outright cruel to him because they think that he is crazy. That can be challenging for some readers, and there were certainly moments where I was like, are you serious right now? This guy needs medical attention. Not that there really was medical attention. It was the 1600s. There is very little empathy amongst the characters that Don Quixote and Sancho run into. The relationship between Sancho and Don Quixote is pretty interesting in that Sancho goes back and forth between believing that Don Quixote truly is a knight errant and thereby lives by different rules, and saying, look, you're seeing these things, I don't see them, I don't think they're real. But Sancho sticks by him and is quite empathetic at times when other people are not. There's quite a lot to be said, I think, about the female characters that are in this novel. For the most part, they are not represented in a flattering way. I did find it interesting that while most of the female characters certainly are fairly romance focused, considered weaker and fitting into a lot of those stereotypes of the time period, there are some female characters that are not like that. In one episode in the book, there is a woman who is beautiful and pursued by all of the single men in her village, and she's not interested in any of them. But the men get upset because she's so beautiful, they've fallen for her, and they blame her for entrapping them, etc., etc. All that kind of sexist nonsense. But what's interesting is that Cervantes does take that and turn it on its head, in that the woman decides she's going to leave. And she grabs her stuff. She decides to live out in the forest. And when Don Quixote does catch up with her, she says, look, I am not here to be with some guy just because he wants to be with me, and it's not my fault they all fell in love with me. So she's separating herself and saying, go find someone else because it's not me. And that's that was to me a very surprising stance for a female character to take in a book from this time period. On the flip side, later on there's an incident in which a man cons a woman into having sex with him before marriage. He promises he's totally going to marry her. They get a servant to like witness that this agreement. They have sex. He disappears. And she's very upset by this, of course, and her honor is maligned. But then later, when she runs into him again, he has married someone else. Against her will, by the way. She didn't want to marry him. She's in love with some other guy. And the first woman, upon seeing her man again, is so happy to see him. And he says, oh yeah, you're right. You know what? I don't want to be with this second woman. I'm coming back to you. And that's got this like happily ever after situation, which, 400 years later, that's a terrible story. At the time, I think it was intended to be humorous or faintly ridiculous, of what a coincidence, we ran into each other again, I'm switching back. But that's gonna make a modern reader cringe. So there are definitely instances like that as well. And then of course you have Don Quixote's lady love herself, Dulcinea del Toboso, who is never seen in this entire book. We, the reader, do not encounter her directly. We hear of her. Don Quixote talks about her all the time, declares her beauty, defends her honor, and carries out adventures in her name. And yet, it's not clear whether she actually exists. Is there a woman by this name? Who knows? And if she does exist, does she even know he's out there? It's hard to say. And of course, the million-dollar question, should you read Don Quixote? Do I recommend it? I think I do. I do recommend it. It is a good book. It's the first real modern novel. There's a lot in here that's interesting. In retrospect, probably would have tried to find someone to read this with me so we could compare notes and talk about it as we went through, because there's so much going on. But it's a good one. I think it's a classic for a reason, and I think it's worthwhile. There's a lot in here about hope and optimism and standing by your beliefs even when everyone else thinks you're off your rocker. So that is, I think, a worthwhile message. So that's it. It's our first big ass book of the year. Fun fact, according to my Goodreads, this is only the 5th longest book that I've read in terms of page count. The other 4, if you're wondering, 2 are anthologies, The Complete Sherlock Holmes and Complete William Shakespeare. And then the other 2 are multiple novels bound into one. Lord of the Rings, 3 novels, and the 3 Gorman Gass novels. So I can see how that happened. I'm still really proud of myself. So that's it. Let me know in the comments, have you read Don Quixote? If so, what did you think of it? And either way, what are you reading next?